Good morning. Buenos dias. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marisol Aviña, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the California Endowment. I am excited to welcome you all to our first Policy Perspectives webinar of the year, the proposed state budget and what to know for 2023. Policy Perspectives is a virtual space that brings together experts and partners to discuss state and federal issues that impact our state and communities. These webinars are nonpartisan, non-political, and non-lobbying informational sessions. The state budget has significant impacts on our lives and our communities, not only because it allocates dollars for all the various public programs and systems, but also because of the policy implications of the decisions that are made through the budget process. As many of you know, Governor Newsom released his proposed state budget on January 10th, marking the start of the budget process. Deliberations, public hearings, and negotiations with the legislature will take place in the coming months and will continue until the parties get to a final agreed-upon budget by the constitutional deadline of June 15th. The 2023 landscape this year is very different from the last two cycles because, as many of you have heard in the news, and we will hear more about this from our speakers today, California is facing a budget deficit this year. So today's webinar, which is a collaboration with our amazing partners, the California Budget and Policy Center and Cruise Strategies, will provide us a high-level overview of the budget, including the magnitude of the budget deficit, what it means for some of the issues we care about, how the governor proposes to address the budget gap, and what it means for future years. And to provide that overview, we will first be joined by Chris Haney, the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. Chris and his team at the center are trusted sources on all things state budget for policymakers, advocates, community organizers, and philanthropy. And we're very lucky to have Chris with us today. After we hear about the budget, we will pause for questions, and then we will shift to the second part of the webinar, which will help us orient ourselves to the changes in the legislature. There are many new names and faces at the Capitol, all of whom will play a role in the decision-making process on the budget and policy. There are also many changes to committee leaderships and memberships, and to help us learn about those changes, we will be joined by Veronica Villalobos Cruz, partner at Cruise Strategies. Veronica will share insights on what we should know about the legislature and its process as the budget season starts. After the presentations, we will have time for Q&A. So just a couple of reminders before we get started. One, we encourage you all to engage in the conversation by posting your questions in the chat, as we will have an opportunity for questions at the end. Also know that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides and speakers' bios after the event. All right, so now to get us started, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Chris, to talk about the state budget.
Great, thanks, Marisol. I appreciate the kind words and very delighted to be with you all here today to talk about the state budget. I am going to run through a lot of information fairly quickly and hopefully at a high level. We have a fair number of details that we can follow up with you afterward. We also have a lot available on our website, and we'll be sharing some links with you along the way here that can give you more detail where I'm having to move pretty quickly through some complex information. But let's start with the overview and big picture of the budget. As Marisol said, the governor's proposed budget for the year is against a very different backdrop than the last couple of years where we've had large state surpluses. Declining economic conditions are resulting in slowing or declining state revenues, and the governor's budget projects that there's a shortfall that has to be closed of about $22.5 billion. That's on a state budget or general fund overall budget that's about $225 billion. So think of it as about 10% in size as a shortfall. The governor is going to close that deficit by doing three things: pulling back on some one-time funding, particularly for infrastructure, climate change, and workforce development, deferring some program expansions or commitments of funding to later years. So instead of those funds being in the next fiscal year, they would start the year after or continue thereafter. And then some trigger cuts or trigger expansions. This is sort of lingo in budget land for cuts or expansions that will only happen depending on whether the revenue's there for the state. So if the revenue's not there and the conditions worsen, there might be further cuts, or if the revenues comes in higher than expected, they have some room to augment certain programs. And what this all means for state leaders is that they face a real challenge. They have to close a projected budget shortfall under state law to have a balanced budget, and they have to prepare for potentially larger shortfalls. And they have to do that while also protecting and continuing to invest in essential public supports for the millions of Californians who will be most harmed by potential economic declining conditions, particularly people of color, LGBTQ plus communities, and people with disabilities in particular. It's also noteworthy that the governor's proposal does not use all of the tools available yet. The governor's proposal doesn't use any of the state's reserves, which the governor anticipates will be around $36 billion for the next fiscal year, and he's not proposing to touch those yet. Part of the reason, we think, is that his Department of Finance and legislative budget leaders are telling advocates already that they think the budget shortfall will be larger by the time the governor's revised proposal is submitted in May. So we'll see what comes with that. But let me walk through some other high-level pieces of the budget and then go through some program by program areas that might be of interest to you all. So one of the things to understand is that the governor's proposal tries to protect a lot of core commitments that were made in prior years' budgets when the state had a surplus and expanded a fair number of programs. I'll talk about a number of those as I go through program by program. One of the things to understand is that some of those things are constitutionally protected or locked up at the beginning of the process. So for instance, there's a minimum guarantee for K12 schools and community college funding called Prop 98, or you'll hear it called the minimum guarantee. And that there's a set of formulas that constitutionally guarantee a certain amount of funding for those systems. When revenues go up, they receive more funding. When revenues go down, they receive less. So you'll hear me say a little bit more about that later. And then the reserves, or the rainy day funds, a couple of the state's reserves are actually constitutionally protected and very similarly automatically increase if revenues increase, automatically decrease if revenues go down. But the state leaders don't have any choice about a couple of those reserve funds, namely the largest reserve fund called the Budget Stabilization Account, and an account that actually protects some funding for K-12 schools and community colleges. Those two accounts primarily are most of the reserves that I was just talking about. So I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that the governor proposes to balance the shortfall or cover the shortfall in three ways. So let me just talk a little bit about the three ways. First, there's the things that are pulled back or withdrawn, essentially things that are reduced or cut. There's about $5.7 billion that the governor pulls back, that spending that was going to happen between the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. Notable items in this category include some workforce development programs, including a state apprenticeship program and some investments in an expanded public health workforce, which I know is something that a number of you are probably interested in. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Several $billion for zero emission vehicles. Infrastructure was pulled back, and there was some transportation infrastructure spending that's also pulled back. There's also a second category of things that are deferred. These are spending commitments that were supposed to happen in the next fiscal year or in the current fiscal year in some cases, spread across multiple years, that the governor is saying will be delayed. Some of them won't start until 2 fiscal years from now. And then things that have multi-year commitments, they'll just get phased back by a year. And I'll mention some of those as we go through program by program. And then there are these things that are triggered if the revenues are there or if they aren't there, cuts or expansions. These things are primarily in the climate change and transportation space. Once again, about $3 billion. Housing, there's about $600 million in potential trigger cuts. Parks, there's about 100 million potential cuts, and in workforce training, there's about 55 million. So I'm going to walk through some program by program summaries, and I'm going to start with health, particularly on Medi-Cal and behavioral health. And the good news is that, as many of you know and probably were a part of helping to make the case for over the last few years, the budget that the governor proposes maintains the commitment to expanding Medi-Cal eligibility to immigrants who are undocumented, including those ages 26 to 49, the group that was the expansion that was enacted in the budget that the state leaders agreed to just this last June. So the money for that expansion continues to go forward. Plans go forward for that to continue to be made available to communities that were not able to access healthcare before. The proposed budget also assumes that federal government will renew California's managed care organization tax, or MCO tax. I won't go into all the details here, but the easiest way to understand this is that this is basically a tax that brings federal dollars into California and helps pay for some of those costs of expanded healthcare coverage. So it's a good news that they're trying to bring in additional dollars from the federal government to help pay for things. The budget maintains earlier years' commitments to behavioral health. The governor and legislature in the last two budgets they passed put some additional behavioral health funding in place, and some are attempting to sort of reform and build out some system sort of elements. All of that continues. There aren't cuts in that space. Notably, the budget doesn't reflect the impact of recent congressional action to end what's called continuous enrollment in Medicaid, or what we call Medi-Cal in California. So this is basically, as part of the pandemic emergency response at the federal level, they've allowed people who are eligible for Medicaid to continue to stay on Medicaid without going through all the hassle of re-upping their application process and determining their eligibility. That emergency action is being allowed to sunset at the federal level, and it could result in a lot of people losing their access to Medi-Cal if there isn't something further done about that, and the governor's budget doesn't say anything on that front. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, there are some cuts in terms of the funding the governor had authorized in the previous fiscal year for public health workforce programs. There was a big allotment, $300 million, that was authorized in the current fiscal year. That's largely protected, but there's about $50 million in public health workforce program funding that is part of the governor's pullbacks or cuts potentially as we go forward. In the education space, from sort of cradle to career, from pre-K to higher ed, the biggest news in this space is that the governor continues to implement a phased-in expansion of universal transitional kindergarten for all 4-year-olds in the state by 2025-26. We're in the early months of the first year of that expansion right now, and the governor maintains funding for that expansion. There's also there's also a maintaining of the funding that had already been authorized for expansion of the state's preschool program to make sure it serves a greater diversity of children, particularly children with disabilities, dual language learners, and 3-year-olds. So those two pieces in the pre-K and TK system go forward. There is a delay of facilities investments in preschool and TK that's part of the governor's deferred strategy. A lot of that money is for facilities, and it rolls out pretty slowly. So most people are saying that's not too big of a deal. There is actually a need to get providers into the system first, and let the facilities grants sort of roll out a little slower. In the K-12 space, funding levels increase due to Prop 98 if revenues go up, as I was saying earlier, and alternatively they go down. Overall, the funding level stays high. The governor also put some supplemental funding to keep it higher given the projected shortfall. Recent investments in a community schools program, which connects schools to local governments and other civic actors to try to build more support overall for kids, that continues. And there's a new proposal for targeted funding via something the governor and his staff are calling an equity multiplier, which would target additional funding to schools that serve the highest percentages or concentration of students who are disadvantaged. And the details of that are forthcoming in the next week or so. It's something we're going to be watching pretty closely. And then in the higher ed space, there's not a lot of new news. The governor maintains earlier commitments to increase the CSU and UC budgets by about 5%. There's an inflationary expansion for community colleges of about 8%. And there's some additional funding the governor's providing to help with enrollment due to enrollment declines that those systems experienced during the pandemic. In the housing and homelessness space, there's not a lot new to say. The governor has maintained earlier commitments to funding for homelessness assistance and combating homelessness. Similarly, has proposed an array of things in prior years around expanding affordable housing. There isn't any new funding in those spaces, and there aren't any new proposals, but the funding that was committed earlier is maintained. The one exception is that there are some trigger reductions for housing that are proposed at about $300 million that would reduce funding for some programs if the state's budget doesn't improve over the course of the year. So that's one piece of it, largely for several programs that have to do with the Dream for All program, Cal HFA accessory dwelling unit program, some things the governor had expanded during the surplus years. In the safety net space, there's not a lot of new news either, but there was a lot of expansion in programs like CalWorks, SSI, SSP, and refundable tax credits like the Cal EITC and the Young Child Tax Credit in earlier years, and all of that is maintained. So that's good news. There is an increase in CalWorks grants by 2.9%, which is required by law because of the overall size of the budget. But there's otherwise not a lot to say that's new in that space. And then I'll just mention a few missed opportunities in the budget. There are a few places that we think that the governor missed out on some chances to provide at least some one-time assistance to deal with some challenges or crises that the state is facing. So the first of those is in food assistance. Millions of Californians are about to face a real crisis because Congress is ending emergency food benefits through SNAP, or CalFresh, as we call it in California. This is all a part of pandemic emergency assistance, and the Congress is allowing that emergency expanded set of benefits to expire. We're talking about a loss of about $500 million in food benefits in California. The average family or household will lose about $80. Families who are very low income and who have kids would probably lose closer to $200 a month in benefits. So it's a pretty significant amount of assistance. And the governor's budget doesn't include any proposals for additional assistance to help cover the gap or the loss because of the expiration. In the childcare space, this childcare system is facing a lot of challenges, both before the pandemic and then exacerbated by the pandemic. There aren't enough slots for the eligible children. There aren't enough providers, which is driven largely by the fact they're not paid well enough by the state in terms of reimbursement rates. The pandemic has resulted in a lot of closures and a lot of providers who left and who haven't necessarily come back yet. And then family fees are still pretty high for low-income folks who might want to access that system. The governor's budget does continue a 100,000 slot expansion that was part of earlier years' budget deals, but this is a space where there is a bit of a delay. 20,000 of those slots would be delayed to the next fiscal year. And the governor's budget doesn't do anything particularly on the reimbursement rate reform issue, which would make sure that providers are paid more of a living wage and allow more people to enter that profession and be able to make ends meet in the state. So that continues to be a big challenge. The governor's budget also doesn't extend temporarily expanded paid sick leave. So we've been providing or requiring employers to provide additional paid sick leave in the state as part of the pandemic. That would expire soon, which would take people back from having a couple of weeks of available leave back to the state mandated level that's usually on the books of a couple of days. So that might be a loss as well, unless something happens in the coming months. And then lastly, we just say that another missed opportunity is that the governor doesn't use all the tools in the toolbox for closing a shortfall. I mentioned that there's no use yet of the reserves. There's nothing proposed on the revenue front. This doesn't all have to happen on the spending front in terms of closing a shortfall. But overall, it's a pretty solid budget. It protects a lot of ongoing core programs, supports, and expansions that happened in earlier years. It pulls back on some one-time and infrastructure investments. That is the type of thing you usually see happen in early years, early periods of a downturn. And then the big concern really is what happens next. There's a lot of unknowns with the economy. The conditions are perhaps more likely to worsen, and so the shortfall could increase by May. And so we may see more of these sorts of deferrals and reductions in spending if that ends up being the case. It also means that there may need to be a use of reserves, and state leaders may need to start putting revenues on the table if the situation worsens. So that's the big picture on the budget. I know I ran through a lot fast or a lot quickly, but hopefully we can take a few questions and see if we can clear up anything I didn't cover or any details that people wanted to know more about.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful overview. That was a lot of really great information. I also want to remind the audience that we did put a lot of links in the chat with additional resources from the Budget and Policy Center, their first look at the budget and other really helpful resources. And I want to appreciate those of you who took the time to submit questions in advance. So we do have one, Chris, that I'd like to ask you regarding the question says, what are the pros and cons to considering the use of rainy day funds reserve in this budget cycle, and especially when federal funding starting in 25 is an unknown?
Yeah, so one of the things to understand about the reserves is that the state leaders can't access all of them all at once. The primary reserve, the budget stabilization account, as they call it, is protected by the Constitution. And in order to use those funds, the governor has to declare a fiscal emergency, which he could certainly do because they're facing a budget shortfall. And then once they do that, they're limited to only being able to use 50% of those funds in the first year of a shortfall. And then after that, they can use them as they see fit in future years. So part of the reason that that fund is built out that way is because oftentimes when the state faces budget shortfalls, they last for more than one fiscal year. And so it was built into the Constitution so that they couldn't use all the funds all at once. But you're not supposed to just have reserves so you can have a large savings account and feel good about that. You're supposed to use reserves to help when conditions worsen and we're in a budget shortfall situation. So I think there's probably some openness on the part of the legislature and the governor to using a portion of the reserves. There's also a safety net reserve that's out there. And I mentioned that there's a schools reserve that's triggered by a formula. So I think you will see some use of reserves, but I think the governor is just holding back on that right now because of a lot of unknowns.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we're gonna shift to the second part of the webinar, but I also want to remind everyone to please go ahead and put any questions in the chat. We will get to more questions at the end. But now to talk about what is going on in the legislature and who's who over there, we're gonna bring Veronica on screen.
Hi, Marisol. Thank you, Marisol, for the introduction, and to Chris for that great comprehensive overview of the budget. As Marisol mentioned, I'm going to try to provide some context around the new legislature, the various points of influences that there are across the street as the budget deliberations move forward, and really how can the public participate in this process. I think we have some slides to go up. So next slide. Thanks, John. So really this is was pulled from Cal Matters, and they have a great legislative resources also on their website. But just as a high-level glimpse of the demographics of the legislature. So after the 2022 elections, as many know, which occurred under the redistricting maps, about a fourth of the legislature is new. So we continue to see the supermajority of Democrats in both the Assembly and the Senate. In the Assembly, there are 62 Democrats and 18 Republicans. And in the Senate, there are 32 Democrats and 8 Republicans. A supermajority, as you may know, helps when there is a need for a 2/3 vote, such as on any proposals that deal with tax increases or potential urgency measures. So the 4 slides here that we are sharing focus on gender, age, birthplace, and race, ethnicity. And it just provides you a glimpse of this new class we have across the street. We have the largest representation of women in California's legislative history, and also the largest Latinas class, now totaling 39. I also thought it was interesting that we see a growing number of millennials in the legislature, and it has grown to about 20 members. So again, this came from Cal Matters, and they've have a great resource on their website. Next slide. So although the majority party didn't change in California, we are seeing the legislature become increasingly more diverse, which helps broaden the legislature's work to be more inclusive and also encompass a broader spectrum of needs. So the various caucuses that you see here are also very influential in moving bills and budget items forward. So those listed on this slide have typically agendas that list their policy priorities and also their budget priorities for the coming year. So it's really great to have access to these caucuses to highlight your budget and policy priorities to see if they would support them. So they also advocate their priorities to the administration during the year and amongst leadership. So, for example, we see with the LGBTQ caucus, they champion bills on transgender health. The Latino caucus prioritized the expansion of Medi-Cal for the undocumented last year. And the Women's Caucus championed significant reproductive justice efforts. And the API caucus fought for millions of dollars of funds to support organizations that combat anti-Asian hate. So they all have an important role in this process of policy and budget. All these caucuses also have a designated staff person who are important to connect with to highlight your priorities. So just wanted to make note of that. Thus far, the Latino caucus has prioritized or has announced that they want to prioritize extreme heat, the issue of extreme heat and farm workers, unemployment insurance for the undocumented, and also homelessness. The Women's Caucus has expressed the need to continue budget investments in childcare, similar to what Chris had mentioned earlier, the need to increase pay for childcare workers and also subsidies for low-income families. So typically, the caucuses gather, I believe, in February and narrow down on the budget and policy priorities. Next slide, please. So this, I just wanted to provide a glimpse of some of the new members that we believe will be active in some of the policy areas of interest. So health, education, human services, climate, that I know folks are watching. And for those who want to participate in the legislative process and will be meeting with policymakers, it's always helpful to know a bit about their background to really see how their life and personal experiences have shaped their perspective on issues. So a little bit of research is always helpful prior to meeting with folks. But I wanted to highlight a few of these folks. So in terms of members who are interested in healthcare and human services, we have Assembly Member Jasmine Baines. She's the first South Asian woman and Sikh to serve in the legislature. She's also a practicing physician from Bakersfield. Assembly Member Schiavo from Santa Clarita is a former advocate with the California Nurses Association and has done a lot of work on guaranteed healthcare reforms. She's also part of Speaker Rendon's leadership team as the new Assistant Majority Whip. And then we have Assemblymember Corey Jackson, who's from Riverside County and has a doctorate in social work and experience running a social service nonprofit. And he will be chairing the Assembly Human Services Committee. We have Senator Carolyn Menjivar, who is the new chair for the Health and Human Services Budget Subcommittee. With such an interesting background, former Marine Corps veteran, or she is a Marine Corps veteran, former EMT, daughter of Salvadorian immigrants. In the budget overview hearing, she spoke of really the need for mental health services, particularly for Black and Brown youth. She also pressed on the need for new investments in childcare, and highlighted concerns with the health workforce cuts. We have Senator Wahab, who represents the city of Hayward and the surrounding area. She's the first Afghan American and Muslim legislator, and she's also a former foster child. She is working on a doctorate focused on economic inequality, and has been advocating for homeownership and renters' rights for some time now. So she's the new chair of the Senate Public Safety Committee, but she also sits on a number of key committees: appropriations, housing, human services, health, and transportation. So she has a lot of committee assignments. We have Senator Padilla of San Diego, Steve Padilla. He is chairing the Senate Budget Subcommittee on State Administration and General Government. So this is a committee that really oversees the homeless and housing funding. So very key. He was also appointed to Ag, Housing, and Natural Resources. He has a particular interest in climate and environment. He had served twice on the California Coastal Commission, and most recently just stepped down. And then I wanted to highlight Senator Lola Smallwood Cuevas of Los Angeles, who is also on the Budget Committee. She most recently served as the project director at the UCLA Labor Center, and she is a former labor organizer. She also sits on a number of key policy committees. She's on rules, education, labor, and natural resources. During the budget hearing, she spoke about the need for continuing investments in workforce, and that seems to be one of her key issues that she will be pressing during the budget process. Next slide. So here we just wanted to highlight on the Assembly side some of the key budget subcommittees. And so these budget subcommittees will be taking what the governor has proposed, and they will be breaking down the proposal, and staff will be analyzing each piece of the proposal, and the Legislative Analyst's Office and the Department of Finance will participate in these hearings, and they will really delve into the details. What may be different from last year is that, there has been the desire expressed that there needs to be rigorous oversight of what the state has been investing in over the last few years. And so we presume that there will be at least a few hearings from the get-go, probably starting in February, about how money is being spent, the timeline of money being spent that has already been, what's been allocated, and what the current needs are. And so I did want to highlight the Legislative Analyst's Office. They recently released a budget review of what the governor had proposed. And so that's on their website. But in that review, they also are highlighting criteria that they're proposing that the legislature use to evaluate spending. And so they're recommending that the legislature look at all new spending over the last 3 years and really look at, are there clear goals in its spending? Have the needs changed? Has the timeline changed? And so this will give you, I think, advocates a good idea of how to prepare for meetings with members. And the Department of Finance is really looking at those questions on how to evaluate the spending that you want to protect or advocate for. And so just would really urge you to look at the LAO's website for that. Next slide. And this is just a few of the key committees in the Senate. They're much smaller, obviously, because the Senate's smaller, but you'll see what I had mentioned, that Senator Menjivar, she's the new chair of Sub 3, which is extremely important. And all the other chairs for resources, Senator Becker has been in the legislature, but he is new to this position. He is from Menlo Menlo Park. Senate Sub 1 on education is fairly the same with the addition of Senator Cuevas. And then, as mentioned, Senate Sub 4, which is like housing and homelessness, we have a new chair, Senator Padilla. Next slide. So initial responses, and as mentioned during the Senate budget overview hearing last week, many members commended the governor for not making extensive reductions and maintaining essential services, including protecting schools and healthcare expansion, maintaining homeless funding. There also seemed to be a general agreement that delays in funding to help address the shortfall is agreeable. There were concerns raised that dealt with like the climate programs, for example. Are we interrupting the momentum here by cutting some of the climate programs? Concerns with the lack of investment in childcare, and then cuts to transportation and workforce. We'll learn more about the Assembly's perspective next week when they convene for their budget overview hearing to see like what the questions are. But they did release, a general priorities document in late December. In their document, they do want to urge consideration of the use of reserves. But in the Senate, it seemed like folks kind of stayed away from that question. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. As Chris mentioned, the forecast between like November and June doesn't look extremely positive. So I think folks will be waiting on the use of reserves till even after the May revise. And there's also like the pressure from all the one-time funding that was made and investments made last year where, advocates are coming back and want to see if they can continue that funding, and members are concerned that, pilot projects or projects that were invested in are now going to go by the wayside if there's no additional funding. So that's going to be an added pressure across the street. Next slide. And then this is just a budget timeline. This is on the websites of the legislature, so you can find it. But we will have hearings between now and May. The May revise comes out May 15th, and we'll see adjustments there. And then the subcommittees have about 2 weeks to really approve their subcommittee budgets. And then it goes to the main budget committee for discussion and approval, all by a vote by June 15th. Last slide. And then just some tips for participating in the process. Start early, start now, be a resource to staff and members. Really, look at these LAO criteria, the questions that they're using about whether investments are being used for the purpose that they were meant to, whether they're timely, and whether the need is still there. So kind of that can help you shape your arguments. For public comment, the Senate will still be using virtual participation, so you could go in person or call in. The Assembly, it's going to be up to each chair, but most are going to have a call-in option from what we heard. All will have in person. And then the Budget Committee also accepts testimony over email. So you can look on their websites, and they usually have a email address to use. And so I know I went over a little time, so I will defer to Q&A, and Marisol, if there's anything we can answer there.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that great overview of the legislature. So now let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. We have a few. So thanks for joining us back on screen, Chris. So let's see, we have a couple, and one of them is a clarifying question for Chris from Peter. So if we could bring that question up on screen, it says, when you refer to the legislature potentially putting revenues into the budget conversation, is that reserve fund you're alluding to, or is that sources of new revenues?
No, thanks, Peter, for setting that question up. Actually, we definitely mean separate from the reserve. So we think there are other tools that state leaders could be using. I mentioned the reserves earlier, but there are ways the state could add to the revenue picture. I think people hear revenues and often think that means raising taxes, and yes, sometimes it does. For instance, corporations in this state are paying about half of their income in taxes today compared to what they did 2 decades ago, and that's due to rate cuts and various sorts of tax breaks they've been given. But there's also a lot of money that the state basically spends or forgoes by giving away tax breaks to high wealth households and corporations, about $70 billion a year at last estimate. And these are various sorts of tax breaks that are rarely evaluated in terms of their success. When they are, they usually show mixed results or they're not meeting their goals. But state leaders don't usually set them up to sunset. They're often expanded year in, year out due to the power of the business lobby or high wealth households. And so we think those things should be evaluated during a time of shortfall. And those are revenues that could go into core programs and supports for people who really need some help.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question is from Maria, and it's regarding public health as it relates to workforce. Can you expand on proposed cuts on public health issues related to the health workforce?
I'll do my best. I don't have all of the details there yet, but so one of the things that the governor did in the current year's budget, the budget we're operating in now, was he proposed, and the state leaders agreed, the legislature agreed, to put $300 million into workforce expansion in terms of local public health workers. And a lot of that was fueled by a response to the pandemic and the need to build up public health infrastructure around the state. My understanding is that pot of one-time funding is largely protected, but there were some other expansions of public health workforce programs that are a part of the cuts that could happen, about $50 million. And I don't have the details on the individual programs, but I can follow up with colleagues and we can try to get that to you if that'd be helpful.
Yeah, and Marisol, I do have a little bit of information in front of me. I know there was a debriefing after the budget came out. So from that debriefing with the department, so if you want to break it down a little bit, it's like the nursing initiative, there's $55 million that will be deferred to 24-25. The community healthcare workers, $130 million deferred. Social workers, $49 million. And then altogether, it's about $400 million delays in workforce investments. The public health training was about $50 million over 4 years. And those will impact the public health pathways training corps, the incumbent worker upskill training, microbiologist training, and the epidemiologic investigation services training programs.
Great. Thank you for that, Veronica. And I think that also addresses one of the last questions that was just put in the chat regarding the deferrals of workforce funding. So thank you for outlining that. One thing that kind of came also through the advanced questions, and I also see here in the chat, is related to small businesses. And so if you can say a little bit about that, if there are any significant cuts that affect small businesses, but also there was a question from the advanced questions regarding supporting small businesses, particularly those owned by women and people of color. So if there's something either here or in past budgets that could relate to those questions, that might be helpful.
So yes, there were grant programs that were put in place as part of prior year budgets that were designed to address the pandemic's effects on small businesses. To the extent that those funds have not all been used, there isn't any pulling back or cuts to those funds, but there also isn't anything new. The one place that there is sort of some new news or some maintaining of meeting some needs is that I mentioned in my presentation that the state had provided some temporary expansion of paid sick leave, requiring employers to provide additional days of sick leave. The governor and the legislature agreed to provide basically a tax credit-like program for small businesses to offset the costs of providing that additional leave. Unfortunately, it was only for larger employers in the small business space. So I think it was 26 employees or more in the small business space. So it didn't cover the smallest employers in the small business and nonprofit space, but the governor does maintain funding for that going forward as one additional support for some small businesses. The other place where there was some news in the budget and for the small business sector is one of the ways that the state covers unemployment insurance benefits during high periods of unemployment, like what we temporarily experienced during the pandemic, is to borrow money from the federal government to cover those rising costs. And we do that because employers in the state aren't really asked to pay in very much to the system, and we end up with big deficits that we cover through loans from the federal government that have to be paid back over time. Those can be paid back either by all of the affected businesses paying higher taxes to cover those costs of that debt going forward, or the state sometimes tries to offset those costs for particular businesses. And the governor and the legislature had signaled that they would like to create a tax credit program for small businesses that would offset those tax increases in future years to pay back this unemployment debt to the federal government. The governor pulls that back and says they're not going to put that money in place going forward. So we'll see what happens with that in the period ahead. But that's the sort of news in the small business space. Otherwise, there isn't a lot new to share, I think, at this point.
Great. Thank you. Anything you want to add to that, Veronica?
No, I mean, yeah, there isn't anything new. I think I would just add that last year, there's a program that small businesses advocated for called the TAPE program, the technical assistance. It's like a technical assistance program for the women's business centers, minority business development agency centers, and small business development centers. And so that was made permanent in last year's budget. And that wasn't touched in the governor's proposal. So, but there's not much in this year's proposal.
Okay, great. And maybe you can also speak to this one, Veronica. Justice to Jobs Coalition is asking about, the process by which local governments, county soups, and executives are made aware of, some of these budget gaps.
Yeah, I think a lot of them depend on CSAC, the county state executives kind of organization who are very active in Sacramento. And I know most counties execs are very active within that. So they're a great resource for county level information. They have a team of advocates split up by issue area. And so I think some of their information is even public on their website in terms of newsletters and highlights of what budget issues are important to the county. So my assumption is that most of them would work through CSAC.
There is one place that the counties are particularly interested in making some headway that actually aligns with anti-poverty advocates and economic security folks, which is in the CalWorks program, there's something called worker participation rates, which basically comes from the federal government, and the state, because it implements the program working with the federal government, has to comply with these worker participation rates, which basically means if you are eligible for CalWorks benefits, you have to show that you're trying to find work, that you're regularly trying to get off the program, in essence. But it becomes a real challenge for the eligible households to maintain their benefits. And if the state doesn't comply, the state has to pay a penalty to the federal government. One of the ways that the state does that is it actually requires counties to actually pay a share of that penalty. And it's been a source of debate for years, because what it does is it actually forces the county to try to steer the program toward compliance rather than using other tools they know might be useful to get people signed up and eligible for CalWorks. So there's been a proposal for the last few years to remove the county penalty, which would reduce the threat of additional costs coming to the counties. And that's something we think might actually move this year, even though there isn't a lot of other news in the CalWorks space.
Okay, Thank you, Chris and Veronica, for that. There is a question regarding public safety expenditures, and I know we also heard a little bit about that in some of the advanced questions. So, Chris, might you be able to say a little bit on the corrections budget?
Yeah, I think the biggest news in the governor's proposal is that he does propose to close one additional prison in the next fiscal year. The state has authorized the closure of 2 prisons in prior fiscal years. One of those has already been closed. The other one is underway or in process. So the governor does propose to close one additional prison. I would note that the Legislative Analyst's Office, the budget office for the legislature, has said that they think the governor could actually close 5 prisons rather than the 3 that are now on the books or that are in his proposal. So there'll probably be some debate about that in the budget cycle to come. I'd also just note that earlier years' budgets have actually eliminated the juvenile justice program at the state level, and that will basically happen over this next year. There are 350 or 360 youth still in that system who will move over from the current state juvenile justice system and be moved over to local probationary systems in the year ahead as part of the winding down of that program. And that's maintained in the governor's budget.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 last questions. Thank you so much for these great questions that I'm seeing in the chat. These are really good. So there's one related to like food supports and CalFresh. Maybe the one from Diane. Might you be able to go over again what's happening to benefits like CalFresh this year, Chris?
Yeah, so in terms of what the state provides in CalFresh, there isn't any new news. The funding is maintained at the level that the state had already committed in earlier years. And that's a lot based on participation rates in CalFresh. So how many people are eligible? Do they sign up? And then the state pays its share of those benefits along with the federal government. But there's not a proposed expansion of that program. There's a parallel program called the California Food Assistance Program that the state set up a number of years ago that's designed to make sure that those benefits are getting to, or similar benefits are being provided to immigrants in the state. The state had been expanding that program earlier to make sure that immigrants who are undocumented could access those benefits because they're restricted by federal law from accessing federal benefits. There's no expansion of that proposed in the governor's proposal. So the big concern here is really that the state isn't trying to fill any of the gap that's coming from the fact that the federal government is actually shutting down its expanded food assistance program that it provided as part of the pandemic. And that means a lot of folks who are struggling because of the economic downturn and need those benefits still, those expanded benefits, are going to be losing some significant aid per month that helps them put food on the table.
Thank you, Chris. And Carissa is asking a question about the equity multiplier in the K12. And I'm not sure if we can answer this question quite yet, because I know we don't have a lot of details in terms of the equity multiplier yet. But she's asking whether with the cuts to emergency food supports, if additional alternative dollars could be incorporated into the equity multiplier or additional funding opportunities to provide food for K-12 students.
Yeah, I suppose that is one avenue, or using existing education programs as a way to provide some nutrition and food assistance through schools might be one alternative. I think if the state has some additional funding or finds some space to help fill the food assistance gap that's coming from the federal government, the clearest route would be through CalFresh and the California Food Assistance Program that I just mentioned, but there may be other ways they could provide that assistance. I think the primary focus of the equity multiplier right now is to actually just target some significant funding to the school districts that really have the very largest or highest concentrations of disadvantaged kids. And I think the real intent here is there continues to be achievement gap problems, particularly for school districts that serve high percentages of Black and Brown students. And they're trying to find a way to get further concentrations into those schools. So that's the first goal of it. But I think the details are forthcoming, and it could be that we see other elements wrapped into that as the details come out.
Yeah, and I would just add that Dr. Weber in the Assembly was the main advocate and championed this issue last year. So she had a draft, she had a bill that the administration then said, we will work with you through the budget. So I think the bill would give you some insight on like where she would like to head. But as Chris mentioned, there'll be more details of the $300 million proposal in budget trailer bill language. And I believe the Department of Finance said like the first week of February, this language should be posted on their website.
Great. Well, thank you both so much, Veronica and Chris. This has been a really great and insightful conversation. We really appreciate your expertise, not just today, but all the work that you do day in and day out to help our communities understand the budget and get engaged in the conversations that affect all of our lives. So thank you both so much. And thanks to our audience for joining us today for this first webinar of the 2023 Policy Perspectives season. We look forward to having you at our next one. We will be sending information about upcoming events. As a reminder, we will be sharing all of the slide decks, the bios, the recording, and the resources that we put on the chat as well, which you will find answers to some of the questions that we unfortunately couldn't get to, but we really appreciate you engaging in the conversation, and we really look forward to having you at the next Policy Perspectives webinar. Have a good day. This concludes our program.